Where we wanted to start off our discussion is this personally identifiable information. And part of what this dives into is something that Angie mentioned with confidentiality. So occasionally you're going to have outside entities. This is part of that case conference setup, like transition service agency representatives or something along those lines. It's going to come into your meeting and they're not employed by your school district. So in those cases, the parent has to consent to them being a part of that meeting. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you bring in outside agents that aren't employees of your building, the parent needs to know that in advance. And they also need prior written consent now to attend. So it's not about excusal here, it's about attendance. So those people, since they're outside agents, they don't have educational reasons to have access to the records. So they have to have consent from that. So that's something to keep in mind always with records. There's some very specific rules around that, the FERPA and different pieces like that. So it's important that as an administrator you're familiar, comfortable with those things, because there's specific timelines and specific rules around how to share information, when to share information, what's okay and what's not okay. And that FERPA regulation is relatively frequently updated, so the rules kind of change here and there. So it's important that you keep an eye on it as, like I said, a building administrator, so you understand. So PII, personally identifiable information. The case conference, the IEP is chock full of it, so it's important that when we invite people into the meeting that they're aware of that. Confidentiality is key, and if you invite someone outside agent, an outside agent, so basically someone that's employed outside of your school district in, the parent needs to make sure that, or get consent to them being invited. Think situations that we used to have like this, we have student mentors sometimes from different agencies that work with a student, talk with them during the day. The parent would have to consent to them being part of that meeting. Other things as far as invitations to keep in mind, you know, the idea with that notice of case conference is to let parents know who to expect to be at that meeting. So there shouldn't be surprises there. So it shouldn't be, hey, just come in and sit down at the meeting. Hey, just come in and be a part of this. So if you have like things like student teachers, stuff like that, make sure it's part of that prior notice, that the parent knows who's coming to the meeting, who's going to be sitting there. So they fully expect that piece. Now the parents don't have that responsibility to us. It's kind of, it would be a nice courteous thing if they're going to bring other people in, but they don't necessarily have to let us know that. One thing I don't think we addressed in the slides is if parents bring an advocate or representation, like a lawyer or something like that, just make sure your school has what's your school policy for those kind of things. What do you want to have happen if a parent comes into a meeting with a lawyer? If a parent comes in with an advocate, the chances are what you truly want is to have your own representation there. But that's up for you to decide. I mean, myself, I wouldn't feel super equipped to be ready for that, because a whole different level of question and different level of knowledge for that legal discussion. So that's not something that I would walk into without pre-knowledge for sure. So that's just something to work out as you. So personally identifiable information. And I guess another little picture of this to keep in mind is access to IEPs, access to student-specific information. Is be very careful with that. You know, don't give out passwords, don't give out access, don't leave IEPs lying around. And only the people who are working with that student need to be aware of what's going on. If they're not working with that individual and they're not going to work in their programs, they probably don't have to know too many details at all. You'll be really stingy with that piece. So that's PIA. Questions, concerns about that one? I know it's a heavy thing to throw on you right after lunch, but hopefully we'll get better from. We'll keep going though. So we have talked a lot about the public agency representative, and one of the things Angie wanted me to share too is we do have videos around this particular role in the case conference. So it's not very long, but it kind of restates the roles and responsibilities here. So I'm going to try to go through this kind of quickly. If you guys have questions, we'll dive in. So this is kind of rephrased from Article 7. So just saying that whenever you see public agency, just the school is a public agency in this case. So that's their designated representative. So the person that fills this role can be, all kinds of different roles, typically a principal or assistant principal, director of special ed. It could be another teacher that's designated in that role. However, if you're going to fit into that role, then these three things need to be true for that person. So you need to be, if you're going to be a public agency representative, you need to be knowledgeable about the services and resources of the public agency and have the ability to commit those resources. So if somebody, say your school principal can't be at that meeting and you're designated as the public agency representative, that's you. That means you get to designate resources, you get to commit resources at that meeting. So the idea with this whole process is, and actually one of the articles in your Padlet I was just reading this morning had a scenario like this where they were talking about some program or service in their meeting, and the response was, well, we need to go consult with our special education director before we can commit resources to that. We don't get to do that. That's the purpose of having this role in the meeting, is you get to decide. And so that means you need to be aware of what's available and aware of what the student needs. I think the big idea is being aware of the student need and problem solving how you're going to meet that need. It doesn't necessarily need to be the first thing on the list, but what's going to meet that need the best way that we can. So it doesn't have to match what the parent brings in, as long as we're meeting that need fully, and we can show that it's going to our best of our knowledge, it's going to meet those needs. So it also talks about the person is qualified to provide or supervise specially designed instruction and is knowledgeable about the general education curriculum. So this person that fills this role has some responsibilities for knowing the resources and to be able to commit them, but also knowledge of the special education services we have available in the building and in general education curriculum. So where that student, being able to talk about where the student can fit in the program and what's available and what's going on around them. It doesn't necessarily have to, like I said, be your school principal, but it can't be just anybody. You have to fill these qualifications. You have to be, someone at the meeting has to fill this role. And we had the question earlier about one person having multiple roles in the building. And one of the things that I always fall back to is teacher of record. We're going to talk about the other roles here shortly. Teacher of record's one of those given roles we have to fulfill. Instructional strategists, and those I don't really have any problem with one person filling both those roles. But once you get beyond that, it gets problematic. If we have just one person filling five, like Angie I think had the example where the speech pathologist is just meeting with the parent one-on-one, then we've kind of missed it there. That person really, if the parent comes to that table and says, I would like a one-on-one aid for my student, does that person have the authority to say yes or no? If they do not, then they should not be filling that role of public agency representative. So that's kind of one of those little, I guess, litmus tests when you go through that. If they say, we're going to buy this program to fill this student's needs, if they don't have the yes or no capability in that meeting, then they probably shouldn't be filling that role. So that's just a couple things like that. So I know I've thrown, that's kind of some heavy-handed examples, but that's the idea. Even small things that, if they can't change the schedule, if we can't adjust our services, if we can't move staff around, because that's the kind of things that administrators will be able to do. But me as a fellow teacher, I couldn't say, well, I can pull them off of this for 20 minutes to come in here. I'm not going to have that authority. Although and if I do say something like that, and it's written into the IEP, then that's what we're going to do. Because remember, we have to implement the IEP as written. Thank you for the choral response. I appreciate that. So just make sure you're still awake out there. So public agency representative, we have a nice short, like 10-minute video on that. So if there's people that need to hear it and see that, it's a nice refresher on what those roles are. If you're going to fill that role in the meeting, make sure that they know what's going on. So we talk about this too. Who can be that public agency representative? Typically, it's an administrator type person that's going to fill that role. It doesn't have to be, but still, building district administrators are typically who you want to fall back on. But it can be your designee. Just know that they have to meet those criteria. They have to be able to, whatever they say goes at that meeting. If they say we're going to buy this system, or we're going to pay for busing, or hey, you know what, private school is a perfect option, let's do that, then your school's on for that piece. So, and that may be the decision that happens anyway, but it's a little more difficult. I don't want to say difficult. It's just a little more challenging when you're not that administrator making the call. So there's some questions around that kind of fits what we've just been talking about. Just make sure if you designate somebody that you're comfortable with them making the call. So it's certainly possible, but you need to back them up in those processes and see how it goes. Other roles, responsibilities, no real big surprises here. We've talked about teacher of record already. That's someone licensed in the disability students eligible for. So we all have to have at least one teacher of record per student, and we only get to have one teacher of record per student. So we used to have that problem in our state. Teacher of service just means anyone serving that student's needs. So I may not be eligible, I might not have the licensure to serve that student's disability area, but I can provide services and supports. The gen ed teachers could be teachers of service. And then we have a gen ed teacher as well. That one's pretty clear. Instructional strategist. This is just the reason this role was put in is so that somebody is at every meeting that can talk about the data. So if the parent brings up questions around, if you guys use iReady or NWEA or looking at your iLearn assessments, SAT data, or even assessment data from their psychological evaluation, then somebody needs to be able to talk about that. You don't necessarily have to know the ins enough to explain what that information means and really explain the connection to what that says to what we're going to be doing, if there is any connection. And then I always say, well, I don't know if I want this recorded or not, but when I run case conferences, there's not always, but there's a lot of times there's that one person I really don't want them to say a whole lot, because you end up kicking them under the table an awful lot, like, no, don't say that. That's the person I always remind them, you are a wonderful note taker. You're so good at it. Every time I read your notes, it feels like I was there. So I really appreciate your work. So you guys are looking around like, I know the person already. So if your name springs to mind, this is not a bad idea. Say, hey, but we do need to take notes. Someone needs to take conference notes. Someone needs to keep track of those pieces. That's another thing, another reason it's difficult to do this with just one person in the room, because how do I lead the conference and take good notes about what's going on and keep the process moving along? That's hard to do, especially if you're a new teacher. It's very difficult, even if you're a veteran of the systems and this work. So taking good notes is an art form, really. And like I said, if you're taking good notes, you don't have a whole lot of time to talk. So if you don't want them to talk very much, there you go. So we have the parent. We have a question earlier. The parent, it's legal guardian, educational representative. Those can be regarded as a parent. Student, once they're turning 18, can be regarded as a parent also. So you need, and that's something that as students turn 17, there is a little line in the IEP talking about transfer of rights, to make sure that everyone's aware of what's going on in those situations. As we're turning 18, the parent rights shift to the student. And if the student, and we talked about that's really important with the notice of procedural safeguards, that the student then is aware of their rights. They know what they can do, what they can ask for, what supports they have, and protections they have in that process. So those are big pieces to keep in mind as we're looking forward. So if you work with students in high school age or older, that's the kind of thing that's going to come into play. And if it's something that you don't feel, there's some very specific guidance around this kind of thing. If you don't feel the student really struggles with those decision-making processes, you can also get support around those things as well, surrogates and supports that way. The last thing I'll talk about with case conference is, I think this is the last thing. We'll see what the slide says. Almost. So this is roles and responsibilities anyway, is attempts. A lot of times we have issues with, and this came up with a different thing earlier, we're trying to get parents to come to a meeting. How long until we can hold a meeting without the parent present? And the rule is not very specific. A lot of folks will fall to 3-strike rule, those kind of things. But truly it just says multiple and varied options. So the key on any of those is to over-document what you're doing, because it's not a comfortable situation to be in the first place. If it's an initial situation, remember we can't do anything unless the parent signs the IEP anyway. If the student's already eligible, then changes might be able to be in place, provided that this 11th instructional days lapse after the parents provided that final document. But Should be a pretty rare occurrence. And really what you're trying to do is lay the groundwork so this parent's just not responsive. We're trying to make an update. We're trying to do this work. And so multiple and varied means just means multiple just means more than one. Typically people go to 3 for whatever reason. We like baseball, I guess. And it has to be varied attempts. So that means that you don't use the same method 3 times. You know, if the email didn't work the first time, it's probably not going to work the second. If a letter home didn't work the first time, it's not going to work that second time either. So a lot of times districts will go through to kind of escalate things, email, letter, certified mail, that kind of thing, and then we move on from there. So the key on all that is, and with all of this really, is to document your interaction. So we sent this home, here's the response. We didn't get one, certified letter went home, this is what happened. We have those documentations. Or if the parent says they're not interested and don't want to attend the meeting, that happens occasionally, make sure that's well documented also. Make sure it's very clear, and preferably in writing if you can get there, but it's probably going to be verbal, I would say.
Even when you get that, ma'am, when you do have a parent that says, I can't come, I can't take off work, I can't get on the phone while I'm at work, it's just not going to happen. Ask them, what would you like to see happen for the next year for the IEP? What is really important to you about what happens with your child? Get that input and document that you are incorporating that into the IEP.
I don't know if everybody heard that or not, but just making sure that if the parent just can't attend, like the situation, hey, I'm working, I can't take off, I've taken 6 days off already, if I take one more, I'm going to get fired. So they can't take the time off. You still take the time on the phone, get there, ask them the questions. What are your concerns? Here's the things we like to do. What do you think about that? Again, write down the questions you ask and write down the response you got, and that's better than nothing. And making sure that's part of the record going forward. So here's, based on what the parent said, here's what we think we're going to do. And they still have the ultimate call to challenge that if that's what they want to do later on. So this is not a fun one to talk about, but something we do need to discuss, the idea of predetermination. So this can come up in all kinds of cases. There are lots of different legal cases around this kind of thing. Predetermination is basically deciding something ahead of time without parent input. And one extreme situation is you have an IEP filled out, parents like, well, I'm going to read to you the goals, I just need you to sign this. You've determined everything about that student's service and placement before the meeting even began. So that's one thing you have to be careful of with things like draft IEPs, is that technically that draft IEP should change from when you share it to when you sign it. There should be things added or changed based on parent input between the beginning and the end. If it's exactly the same from here to the end, then either you've done a perfect job doing it, but at least the conference notes need to be updated and show you, hey, we all agreed that this is what we're going to do after we reviewed this with the parents. So be very cautious about sharing the draft and just leaving it alone. So now, one of the key things in this process is there's nothing wrong with you preparing for a conference. There's nothing wrong with you setting things up and having those discussions. The key word is discussion, not decision. So we're discussing our options, we're sharing those options we have here. Let's consider these things that we have potentially for the student to fit their needs. Then when we get to the meeting, let's figure out which one suits best. That's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be a case conference for you to meet ahead of time and talk through things. That's absolutely fine. Just when you make decisions without the parent present and without their input, there you get into trouble. Now that doesn't necessarily mean, like it says here, that we just do everything a parent asks us for. Their voice is one voice of many. So it's important we take their input and document it. We don't necessarily have to, even if we don't agree with it, if they state something about a student's need, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to serve their need the way that they thought, but we have to figure out a way to do that. So I know in one school system, here's a reading system that they use. We don't necessarily have that here, but we have one that fits that need, that meets that outcome, that will get the student where we want them to go. With same kind of, we might have a different behavior plan, a different procedure we follow. We're still meeting that need, just in a little different way. So that's okay, but we want to document the parent requested these things, here's our response. And ideally we spend the time talking the parent through that So here, we're still going to meet the need in these ways. It's just called something different, different program, different system, different ideas behind it, but we're still going to get from A to B through the course of this case, or IEP year, I guess. One of the key things is placement is a discussion that happens at the meeting, not before. Eligibility happens at the meeting, not before. Services continue, and those decisions are made there. So like I said, discussions can happen ahead, decisions happen at the meeting, making sure the parent has. And it's important, like I mentioned with notes, that we document that interaction with parents. If you don't do anything else in notes, that's probably the most important thing. Mom brought in this concern that she saw at home. Here's what we think we need to do about it at school, and here's where it is spelled out in the IEP. So we talked about some of these pieces, but I did want to make sure mutually agreed upon time and place is a key. It's mutual. It's not just one person, one side or the other saying, here's where we're going to meet, which time and what place we're going to meet there. So, and I think where you're going to run into some issues sometimes is when IEPs are about to expire. How many people stay up at night like, oh, that IEP is about to go. What are we going to do about it? I can't get hold of the parent, or they've been sick, they've been out of town. What are we going to do about it? And a couple things to keep in mind. I know if the student's already eligible, it's the previous IEP is still going to remain in effect. So just keep that in mind. Even if we miss a timeline, can't hold a case conference when we'd like to, the previous IEP is still working. Even though it's technically expired, IEPs don't really expire. You know, if the students disappeared for 2 years and they come back, we still follow the old IEP until we know better. And that Angie talked about that with the move-in timelines a little bit. We just do the best we can with what we know and do better when we know better. So that's something to keep in mind. So even if the parent, even if the timeline is going to pass, but the parent says, I'd like to meet, I know I can't do it now, but I'd like to meet next week, 3 days after the IEP ends, don't hold the case conference without them just because of that. Wait for them, hold the case conference. It's more valuable to have them at the meeting than to meet that deadline. So just keep that in mind. These are things these are the kind of things that get you kicked under a table if you say them at a meeting. You guys could probably add to this list. Hey, we only have an hour, let's go. You know, that kind of thing. Well, there's no way we can do that. There's no way we can increase minutes. This is the most we can do. You start going those lines, we're putting limitations on there that are administrative and not based on the student needs. So we have to be thoughtful about that. Not to say, again, we have to agree with every proposal that's laid out, but we have to have a response. Here's what the student's needs are. Here's what our response is going to be, happens to be. So there's just a few things. And I guess the last piece is consider your audience when you're talking to parents. Make sure, like somebody caught me on FIEPs earlier today. You know, when you start throwing that lingo out here, we use it, it's the special ed language, it's our little internal language to each other, and not everybody's in on it. So it's important. It's like listening to my kids talk on a video game. It's like, I don't understand a word you just said. I know you were talking. There's words coming out of your mouth, but it didn't make any sense. So, you know, think that through a little bit. Make sure everyone at the table understands your conversations. Placement decisions. So I think Marcy talked about this first today, but it needs to be really clear when we talk about students that every student, no matter who it is or what they come from, starts as a general education student first. So every student starts there. We have to justify in our IEP any removal from that setting. So that's important. The least restrictive environment, there's a justification for that choice and a consideration of potential harmful effects if we choose anything other than the full-time in a general education setting. So we have to think about that. Every student starts there. And we need to really wear ourselves out trying to think of all the ways that the student can continue to be included with their peers. So we exhaust those, and occasionally we will exhaust those options. Like, well, we tried this, here's the only thing we can think of is this. But we were trying everything along the way. So that's an important piece. When you go from, you know, placing a student in gen ed setting, we don't get to jump, hey, homebound. We actually have a discussion about other options along the way. Because that homebound instruction is the most restrictive environment we're going to find. So that's our last option. And should be very rare. So we want to think about how do we keep the student in the classroom as much as possible? What accommodations, supports, modifications to the curriculum and environment, everything we can think of to keep them in there, because we know that's the best outcome, that's going to produce the best outcome for our students. They're going to get the best opportunity to learn and grow there. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, we don't have anywhere in our IEP where we have to justify a student being placed in a gen ed setting. We start there. We justify removal from that location. So that's an important piece. And this is I think my last slide. I know, almost, sorry. I know you got excited there for a minute. But this is the kind of continuum of least restrictive environment placements. So thinking about, here's general education, that's the most included environment, all the way to home or hospital bound, which is the least included environment in the cascade within there. So be very careful in this process that we don't just pigeonhole kids if they're a resource room kid. They get this much, or we have to think about what's the best suited placement for this individual as we're considering it. And that might mean, I've been to some school systems where we have general ed classroom, we have co-taught classroom, we have self-contained life skills program. And that's the programs they have available. And then when someone doesn't fit one of those three pieces, they really kind of freak out. Like, what do we do? This kid needs just a resource support for one period a day, but we don't have that built into our schedule or system. So we have to back up a little bit. It's our schedule and system that's not serving the needs of the students. So we have to figure out how we're going to make that work. And it's going to be a little scary as we make those changes, but we have to make some steps to do that. So some key messages. I like this one. Every opportunity, every interaction with parent is an opportunity to build a relationship, and that's what we want. We want to have that relationship so we can have it. We're all in a partnership working with the student to get them to the best place we can. Let's see. One of the things that as an administrator, your role is kind of the arbiter of the policy and procedure. So when you're at the meeting, keeping us on pace, making sure we're following the procedures as the rules spell out for us, keep things running smoothly. That's part of your role, is to know what's coming up, what we're going to talk about, what's going to happen next. You may not know all the details and ins and outs that the special ed teacher does, but you know the process. I know that in order for this to be a good case conference, we've got to meet each one of these pieces, talk about this content, and we're going to get to a good place, hopefully then. And hopefully that'll help you run smoothly. So that's a lot. Implementing IEPs, case conference committee procedures and process. There's a lot of things going on in there. Any questions before I hand off? You guys are like anxious for Angie to get back up front, I know. Any questions or concerns? First of all, I do really appreciate your questions. That really helps kind of guide the discussion as we're going. And I think when someone asked it, there's 5 other people who didn't ask that wanted to. So I appreciate you guys stepping out and doing that. So that makes our day a lot more entertaining too when we get to interact with folks instead of just stand up here and read off a slide. It's fun to stare at people in the crowd, but it's much more interactive, much more fun this way. So I appreciate that. So with that, I am going to hand off to the master of challenging behaviors.
Yeah, behavior kids are not my favorite. They really aren't. And especially middle school behavior is like my least favorite of all the beasts that are out there. But we have to deal with these things. And so we want to start by thinking, how do we avoid it in the first place? The preventative end of things. But when something does happen, how do we address it? And then when it crosses that line of, oh, it's big, right? And now we're up for yet another meeting. What happens during that meeting? So we're going to hit all of those parts. We're going to start with prevention. And this is nothing that you don't already know. It really isn't. Got to have a solid core. We can't expect that just because they're a high school kid or that they're 18, right, that they know or are capable of what we want to happen. So just like anything else, no matter what the age of the student is, from 3 on to 22, if they aren't doing it, we've got to figure out, is it because they don't know it and they don't have a skill to replace what they already are doing, Or is it a fluency issue, meaning I can do it under the right circumstances. I can keep calm when we practice one-on-one, but when push comes to shove and I'm faced with something stressful, suddenly my skill set is gone, right? So sometimes it's being able to put it into place, and sometimes it's I don't even know where to begin. So we have to teach those things, and we know that the tier 1 for supporting mental wellness and behavior in schools is going to be different in every one of your schools. You got different kids, you got different faculty, you got different communities, and so whether or not you have daily character education, or whether or not you have these 7 beautiful rules posted in every hallway and procedures is different. And so y'all have to figure out what you need on that individual level. But having that solid tier 1, rather than being reactive and saying, oh my gosh, we had 10 bullying complaints today, let's put bullying at tier 1 and let's talk about that stuff for everybody. When it becomes a major issue, it's an everybody issue. Making sure that we have those tier 2 and tier 3 supports for the smaller groups of students or the intensively needy students in those areas. But you got to have something to fall back on. So if you know it's bubbling up as a need, having something ready and waiting that I can plug a kid into for support, to learn that skill, to practice that skill, to go to a lunch bunch where I'm working on how to interact with my peers appropriately, to have structured playtime at recess rather than let's just let them loose and see what happens. You have all of those different things in place. Having relationship building at the forefront. Some of this can come into play by what happens during your school day, whether you have morning meeting, community circles, we have beautiful things out there that lots of schools are doing and doing well. But also having things in place such as the administrators saying, you know what, don't send me a kid. Don't send a kid to the office. You got a problem? Call me. I'll come take your class for 5 minutes. You go out in the hall with this kid, build the relationship, address the behavior. Huge, huge difference in that approach. It's a pain in the butt for those of you who are administrators, right? Because you got to step out of your area and everything else that you're responsible for. But when that starts happening, you get fewer and fewer issues going on, and that relationship is always continuing to build. Knowing things like, I've got concerns about these 2 kids in my class, so I'm going to do a 2x10. You guys heard of 2x10? 2x10 is just a simple evidence-based strategy where for 10 days in a row, I'm going to take a kid that I want to build a relationship and take 2 minutes just to have a conversation. Not about school, not about my concerns, but hey, how's it going? Tell me how your day is. What do you like to do? Just relationship building can make a big, big difference. Providing support to teachers. If you have a teacher that's got a classroom that's out of control, they need support. They either don't have that skill set that they need, or they don't have a good classroom management system, or maybe they don't know that the rest of the building is doing positive behavior intervention supports because they came in 2 months into the school year and missed the training. What do they need to be successful in the classroom? We talked about positive connections, and not just, this isn't just for classroom teachers. Administrators you know who those kids are, right? You know that I don't want to see this kid in the office. I'm going to catch them in the hallway and talk to them about the good stuff. I'm going to make sure that they know that I know their name for good reasons and not just for when they get sent down. And then really considering, can I put consequences in place for minor behaviors that involve instruction? So not a demerit, not losing a card. I hate the card system so much. Not missing points, missing recess, but you had trouble with using appropriate language, and so the consequences, we're going to sit down and have a conversation on, here are things that I can legally and not get in trouble say when I'm stressed or when I don't like something. Kid who tears up something, consequences that are instructional are about the importance of the law, the importance of maybe doing some restitution for I tore up this kid's book and now I'm going to have to fix it, I'm going to have to mend it. You know, anything that is logical or natural consequence or instructional is going to have more impact than a detention. I had many detentions when I was younger for not doing homework. That was my biggest detention offense. I didn't do my homework. It was a time, this was back in the day where detention was you don't do work, you don't read, and you don't talk. That was awesome, right? I enjoyed just sitting quietly for 30 minutes. How many of your kids who get suspended are like, whoop, day off? Yeah. And the teachers say, whoop, day off from that kid, right? It's reinforcing for that to happen again. So we kind of have to rethink how we do this. Even though the handbook says this, maybe the handbook shouldn't say that. Maybe we need to rethink our handbooks. Making sure we have good communication happening within the building, consistency among the rules and what's happening from class to class, especially for you with older kids who are moving from very different rules in one class to another class. Making sure that every person involved with students with disabilities knows what their responsibility is, especially when it comes to behavior plans. If somebody drops the ball and they don't follow the behavior plan when something happens, that is fodder for a complaint or due process situation, and you don't want to be in that boat. So making sure that everybody understands what their part is really important. And then also making sure that everyone understands what a removal is. So Article 7 doesn't really talk about suspensions, expulsions, detentions, demerits, anything like that. It talks mostly about removals. And removal is any time that you're away from everybody else. Whether it's suspended for a day or an hour, it's a day of removal. If somebody says, Mom, can you just come pick him up? Today's kind of a wash. It's 2 o'clock, just pick him up and take him home. Technically, that's a day of removal.
Even if it's an hour?
Even if it's an hour, even if it's 15 minutes, technically it should be a day of removal, which means let's not do that. If we've got 10 days that we could potentially use for those crisis kind of situations, let's spare them to really use them wisely. And hopefully not at all, but that's why the preventative end of things. And the more that we can intervene and get ahead of things, not wait until it's to the point of we got to give some days home. Let's figure out what we can do to set a kid up for success. But things are still going to happen, right? No matter, we could prevent, have the most beautiful, nurturing environment ever, and still we're going to have some disciplinary things that happen. So let's figure out what we do here. First thing is, are we part of it? Is the situation part of it? And I would say there are a lot of times that yes, that is the case. There could be something in the environment. It could be that this kid just flew off the handle and punched somebody, but he has to sit next to Sally, who never is quiet, ever, right? There are things that we can sometimes change. We know we have a lot of kids, especially kids on the autism spectrum, who have very big sensory issues, right? Sometimes the sound of fluorescent lights or the glare is enough to send them over the edge. It could be things are too dark, too cold, too loud, too busy. To anything. I know Marcy mentioned this morning, I'm driven by food. And when I am hungry, I am shaky and I am angry. And that is just part of it, right? So managing that kind of stuff. And we know you've all probably had a kid where you kept a drawer full of snacks because if they came in and they were hungry, behaviors are going to happen. And so we can sometimes head that off by just a couple of peanut butter, peanut butter is a dangerous term in most schools, but a package of Cheez-Its or something, yes, something like that can help with things. So environmental conditions, adult behaviors, right? I know how to set my husband off. There are trigger words that I can say that I know we're gonna fight, right? That's just the way it is. It's the same thing with kids. And sometimes if I'm the adult in the room and I'm not in control of my own emotions, it can escalate. We have to really get in touch with that. We have some teachers that are not a good match for certain students. I think in involving students in creating their behavior plan, and I'm not just talking about for the high school kids, but even little kids, makes a big difference. I would want to be in on my own behavior plan, right? I don't want somebody putting a plan for me. I need to have a little bit of buy-in. Whether it's about the rewards, whether it's about just sharing what I look like as I escalate, and older kids tend to have a little bit more insight. But the further back that we can identify the very first step that could lead to that pathway, the further back we catch it, the better. Whether it's, the student who just starts twirling their hair and whoop, I see the hair twirl, I know what comes next. Even if it's a couple steps back, that still can be the point to where I say, why don't you go get a drink and come back? Anything to steer the pathway. Does the student have a BIP? Do they have a behavior intervention plan? And then the big question, if they did we follow it? My answer is that both a functional behavioral assessment and a behavior plan should be a team effort. It's a reevaluation. The functional behavioral assessment is an evaluation process, which means it shouldn't be a one-man show because we're gathering input from lots of people, which is typical. But even then, if I try to just look at all the information and come up with what I think something is, I'm more likely to be wrong than if I have multiple views saying, well, but did you think about this? We're much more likely as a team to be able to interpret that information. But I think when it comes to the actual behavior plan, and I'm saying this as a psychologist, I think the classroom teachers have to be at the front of that because you all are going to be the one implementing. I could give you some glorious plan that you will look at me and say, yeah, right. I have, a day and a horde of people that are going to help me with this, right? It's got to be based on reality. And you all are going to know the student much better than the evaluators. The evaluators come and go. The teachers are there every day. So team approach always for any of that kind of stuff. So again, if you determine that the student doesn't have the actual skill that they need, we got to teach it. Regardless of their age, we have to teach that skill. We have to practice it. We have to provide opportunities to practice it in a safe environment first so that as things get more and more difficult, I could maybe use the skill. And then point it out. When we do have a success, if it's that, this kid went all day long and they only got called out for doing something 4 times, but they had been at 15, we celebrate that 4 day. You mean for a functional behavioral assessment? It is like any other evaluation process. A functional behavioral assessment is a requirement if you're doing an initial ED evaluation, emotional disability. And it's a requirement, which we'll talk about here in a minute, when certain behaviors happen to where you've crossed that line, right? And you've had too many days of removal. Who does it is a different story. There's no requirement that says it has to be a psychologist, it has to be an ED teacher, there's nothing like that. It's just a requirement that it happens. There's also no specific requirement about it takes these forms and processes. It leaves it to the judgment of the team to say, I've been in places where I did multiple observations, I did setting events checklists, I did some rating scales, I did interviews, and then we pull it all together. but how it looks is very different from place to place. First thing you do when a behavior happens, let's look at the relationship. Because if the relationship between the teacher and the student, or the student and another student, or something like that, if I punch somebody, there's a relationship damage that may have happened here. If any of this has happened, we got to fix it. That should be our first thought, is let's work this out. Whether it's a restorative conversation, whether it's making up for something, I tore up something of yours, or knocked all your stuff on the floor, or whatever, or called you names. But we got to fix that piece. If anybody was hurt, relationship-wise, or even physically, and sometimes physically we're talking about serious issues. Some of you have probably had students who have hurt someone bad enough to where parents may be calling the authorities and filing charges. Or hurt a teacher. So we work on that stuff, try to fix the issues that are there, and we have to think about, is there something other than removal that we can do? Because if there is, let's go that way. It's just like thinking about least restrictive environment. We go with the most, or the least intrusive, I guess, to the student's world as possible. And so if there's something else I can do, let's do that. Removal should be our last option that we're thinking about. So again, when we're talking about removals, any part of the day, that's what the law says. Now, you could interpret that down to 2 minutes early, but come on, let's. But I think if you're talking about an hour early, that can add up, because we do have schools who every day Grandma gets a call to say, yeah, I think we should just go home early. Yes, and then you're missing a subject, right? That could be a whole class every day. Now,
suspension.
Yes.
And this is where it gets kind of hairy sometimes, I feel. In-school suspension.
We're going to talk about that next.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
and that's tricky. It's
It
very
is.
tricky. So the only difference here is sometimes within a behavior plan, in order to make the IEP happen, we have certain students that may need a short-term removal to help that plan work. It would need to be written into the behavior plan. Like, we have some students who, when my blood sugar drops, maybe I have other health impairment for diabetes, and when my blood sugar drops or skyrockets, if I were to stay, that day is going to be lost, right? It's just going to get worse from there. Or I have other medical issues that I know that I need rest. That could be written into the plan. It just would be the exception, not the rule. You're not going to find that in very many IEPs. If that is the case and it's part of the behavior plan and we're following the behavior plan, it is not considered a removal. Okay? Now, in school, you have to count in school as a day of removal unless you can satisfy all these requirements. So number one, they have to be able to continue to progress in the gen ed curriculum. That does not mean they sit in the gen ed setting, but it means I'm continuing to make progress in the gen ed curriculum, and I've got to get all my IEP services, which either means a special ed teacher's got to come down and give them to me, or I have to be released from in school long enough to go in, get what I need, and come back to that setting and just maybe not be part of recess or whatever. The second piece is the student has to be included with gen ed peers to the extent that they would have on their IEP. So if I'm in a self-contained placement and I'm in school and I'm the only one, I'm still removed, right? But if I'm a kid who's in the gen ed class most of the day, but I'm the only kid in school, or I'm pulled into a separate setting with only students with disabilities, then I'm not going to be able to count that as being at school. Attendance-wise, yes, but a removal date is different.
So if there's other kids in there in the in-school?
Yes.
Say there, it's inclusion, but if there's other kids that are in there in the in-school, then it would still it wouldn't, but they received their.
And you have to get your services, yes,
So then it would not count as a removal.
correct.
Okay.
It's just really hard. It's hard enough in a charter school because you usually have fewer staff, right? You're spread thin across lots of different classrooms. It's hard enough to make every day happen. But if you're making every day happen and you're giving services and you're going into classrooms and doing all this stuff, and now I got to go down and give services to my kid that's in school, sometimes it's not worth the effort and it's just take the removal, right? But it can happen. So you really have to weigh it out and record it appropriately so that you know it's a day of removal or not. Uh-huh.
So, do the scholars have to be at the same grade if they're in school?
No.
No, just,
They just need to be included just like anybody else. I mean, included with their peers. Now, the problem is if I'm the only kid in school and your whole, yeah, and I'm all alone.
so no, like if I'm a fifth grader and I'm in school with second graders, is that considered?
You're still in with other kids, so it's whether or not you got your services that day.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the bus, right? Does anybody have busing? Then I'm just talking to you. Okay. So the only thing to know really about transportation is it's not whether I got kicked off the bus. It's whether I got kicked off the bus and special transportation, like I can't ride the bus with everybody else. If I have special transportation on my IEP and I get kicked off that bus, then it's a day of removal unless we provide alternate transportation, which could mean paying the parent the mileage to take them back and forth. Yes. So, but otherwise, if I get kicked, if I would have gotten kicked off the bus as an elementary school kid, my parent would have to drive me, just like anybody else. But if I have special transportation, it's different.
Isn't it kind of frowned upon, though, to take away the bus?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like,
But, yeah.
Okay.
But sometimes you've got the kid who is just out of control on the bus. And, there are places that have a hardline policy. Even if it's no gum on the bus and you had gum, that's 2 days off. I don't believe that anybody has to provide it unless they provide transportation to other kids. Yeah. Now, you could choose to do that. You can always choose to give something more, but and I could be wrong, so team, correct me if anybody knows anything different. But my understanding is if you don't provide busing to everybody, you don't have to provide special transportation. All right, so change of placement is another term you've got to understand. Change of placement in this case when we're talking about a disciplinary change of placement. Not change of placement meaning we went from resource placement to homebound, right? This means that you have been removed enough to where it is pretty much a change of placement. Right? You've been away from what you're supposed to typically be in, that it's like a change of placement. And this happens when you get more than 10 consecutive days, automatically, boom, it's a change of placement.
10 consecutive days.
Yes. Now, the other piece is if you get more than 10, and there is a line, it's more than, it's not at 10, it is moving a step beyond that, more than 10 cumulative days in a school year, then it's up to the district to determine has a change of placement taken place or not. Now I will tell you that most districts just choose to say, forget that. Once we pass 10 days, we're just going to assume a change of placement has happened. We're going to follow the next steps that we have to do as far as manifestation determination and all that. But technically, the law says what you're supposed to do is figure it out. Because there's a big difference between I got 5 days out in August, and then I got 5 days in early September, and then I'm up for 2 more, right? Those are pretty packed in there. Or if it's the same behavior every time. clearly something has happened that really is a change of placement. But that's different to me than I got 1 day in August, then in September I got caught smoking and I got 3 days out, and then in December I skipped school and I got this many days, right? And it's really different and it's spread out throughout the year. And then something happens in May that's going to tip me beyond that 10 days. We may say, you know what, that's really not a pattern that looks like a change of placement. But in my view, it's better safe than sorry to say, let's just follow the procedure. So you have to determine that at the local level. So when we say yes, a change of placement has occurred in either of those situations, number one, send that notice of procedural safeguards home on the day that that administrator says, here's what's going to be handed down and it's going to take you beyond that 10 days. Send it that day. The law says if you can't do it on that day, it's got to be in the mail the next business day. So you got a little bit of leeway because maybe I punched somebody at the basketball game, right? And the office is locked and parents not there. I may not be able to hand that to them or send it in that letter that day or send it home in the backpack or whatever, but I can at least get it in the mail the next day. So that's the first step. The next thing is within 10 school days, 10 instructional days, we have to hold a manifestation determination conference. What the law says and what the parent rights talk about is that a student has to be afforded some protections for not necessarily getting penalized in the same way if something that happened is because of my disability or because of the school's failure to actually put the IEP in place the way it should.
And then when it's not.
And then,
Both of those things are like everything is kosher and it's not.
and then something can happen. So like if I'm up for expulsion, right? Maybe I brought drugs to school, okay?
Shame on you.
A shame on me. And sometimes it is, right? Sometimes it truly is a shame on you. That was a stupid decision, but it had nothing to do with your disability. And the school was following your plan and doing everything we were supposed to do, and you made a bad decision. And if the consequence is expulsion, then now you go to an expulsion hearing, right? But if I got in trouble for going in the teacher's lounge and the door is marked teachers only, and I can't read, do I get penalized the same way? There are kids that sometimes do things that are out of their control. And that's what this whole process is about when we go into a manifestation determination hearing. So let's talk about the ins and outs of that. All right, so now we got our fun meetings. These are the least favorite meetings of all my meetings that I attend. It's not fun, but we're holding this within that 10-day window, and it truly is an evaluative process, which means it is not a judgment kind of thing of the one person with the gavel saying, I have now decided this is a manifestation or is not, right? It's a team decision just like anything else where we're coming to consensus, which means the parent is part of that. But ultimately, we know that any time that we try to get consensus and we can't all come to terms, it is that public agency representative's responsibility to say, here's what we believe as the public agency. They're the spokesperson, ultimately, okay? So the whole process is taking lots of information and determining whether what the student did, what that disciplinary action was, is caused by or had at least a substantial and direct relationship to their disability, or it's the result of us not putting the IEP in place. And it doesn't mean just not having an IEP, it means we dropped the ball on the behavior plan, or I wasn't giving you services, or I didn't put the accommodations in place and this kid got really ticked because nobody was reading their test to them, right? Sometimes those things are triggers, to use the forbidden word. So when we have these meetings, we've got to review information. And we're going to look at information about what's my disability. We're probably going to look at the last evaluation. What are the characteristics of my disability? If you've got 10 kids with autism, you've got 10 kids with autism, and they are not alike, right? 10 kids with an emotional disability show different behaviors. What are the characteristics of my disability? We also need to look about what happened, but what you don't want to do is have the formal reading of the charges, right? This shouldn't sound like a court case. And I have been in those meetings where I've got to read the whole disciplinary incident, and you're already going to put parents and the student on the defensive right there. They're not going to be part of that meeting anymore if you sit and read the charges. It is also not the place to discuss, I didn't do it. It didn't happen. That already happened, right? You, as the administrators, have already figured that out. The assumption now is we're at this meeting, you did it, even if you say you didn't, right? We've determined that it happened. We just want to know the circumstances around what happened. You know, I've had really good conversations at manifestation meetings that led us to have some thoughts about how can we change things? How can we make this not happen again? And sometimes it's because of student input and telling us more about things. We want to look at the history of the behavior too. If this is occurring every year, or every month, or every winter, or whatever, that tells us some more. We also have to consider, are there other suspected disabilities? And I have been in a situation with the district where the student had a couple of disabilities identified, but the school strongly suspected emotional disability, and the parent would not allow a reevaluation. But the school knew it, right? The school suspected it, and they could see the characteristics of it. They still have to consider those. Even if the parent hasn't let that be identified, if you know it, you're just assumed to have knowledge of that particular disability, even kind of like we do when a student has not even been identified for special ed. We look at the implementation of the IEP, and if there was one, the behavior plan, and ask those questions. Was it followed? So if we say yes to either of those questions up in the corner, as far as was it related, or is it because we failed to do what we were supposed to do, then it is considered a manifestation of the student's disability. And if we find that there is a manifestation relationship, then number one, if it was because we didn't do something, we fix that, right? And I would own up to it in the meeting and say, you know what, we think that this happened because we didn't follow the behavior plan. Just tell the parent, we're going to schedule a training to work with the student's teachers so that they know exactly what to do. We'll do better. Much better to own up to that stuff than to have that swept under the table. You want to look at why did something fail too. And again, most of the times when something fails, it's because I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And so we train that out, you know. You also may need to figure out, are there compensatory actions? And the compensatory term I know is one that we don't really want to talk about, but is this because you were supposed to have therapy once a week and you haven't been getting it because maybe we couldn't find a therapist, right? It's on the IEP, but we couldn't find somebody. Or somebody else thought, oh, he's on your caseload, right? No, he's on mine and I've missed it for 4 weeks. Compensatory just means I missed the 4 weeks. How am I going to make that up? How am I going to get the student what they need to be successful? Now, again, if we determine there's a manifestation relationship, we have to, by law, conduct a functional behavioral assessment and put together a behavior intervention plan. For many of our students, it was already in place. So if it's already in place, we need to take a good hard look at, is it still appropriate? Because maybe the behaviors have changed. Maybe it's old and the student, you know, they've grown a lot. Things are different. But it's also possible that the FBA and behavior plan could be in pretty good shape, and that we need something else to support the student. But we have to make sure that if one's not already done, we've got to get one in place. Then the law says you got to put the kid right back where they were. Very hard, right? Especially when you've got a kid who you're a little concerned of what's going to happen. This is what the law says. Now, if the team agrees that in order to change the behavior plan, we need to also change placement, and the parent is on board, now that's a key here, then you can make a change. Otherwise, the student goes right back where they were, okay? That's different than just saying, you know what? I think it'd probably be better if we went to homebound or to a self-contained program or something like that. It has to be part of really having to change that behavior plan and needing to have a change of placement and the parent being on board. Because if the parent says no, they were in gen ed, I want them back in gen ed, that's where the student is going. Then you can have another conference and maybe have that conversation again. But at the manifestation, you have to stick within this to make sure that they go back where they were. Because what we're either saying is it wasn't quite your fault, or it was our fault, and so therefore you should be entitled to go back where you were. Now, if we determine that it was just misbehavior, right? It's not a manifestation, you messed up, right? Then we can go ahead and move forward with whatever discipline the school would normally do. However, services can't stop, right? If I'm a gen ed student only and I get expelled, I'm home until the new school year starts or whenever that time period lapses. If I'm a student with a disability, then the committee has to deliberately think about what does this kid need in order to continue working on those IEP goals, and to potentially build in some behavior stuff and planning to make sure when I do come back, this ain't gonna happen again. So your education has to continue, which again is why if I've got a kid in the beginning, even before they've started in special ed, that's got a lot of behavioral issues, I'm going to hit these parts of the notice of procedural safeguard harder with the parents so that they understand what their rights are related to discipline and continuing that education. Now, we do have some exceptions, and these come up. So regardless of whether or not there was a manifestation relationship, if it's some serious stuff, meaning if I bring a weapon to school, and we know that some things are considered weapons and some are not, and that's part of Indiana statute. But if I carry a weapon to school, if I'm possessing a weapon, if I am using or possessing illegal drugs at school, or selling or trying to sell controlled substance, if I bring my Ritalin to school and I'm trying to sell it off, then the school has the option of removing the student to an interim alternative educational setting for up to 45 school days, regardless. Even if it was directly related to my disability, these things are serious enough to say, yeah, but we got to have you over here instead, okay? Now, the other one,
45 days.
I'm sorry?
What happens after the 45 days?
You got to have another meeting and figure out what happens at that point, yeah. The other one is inflicting serious bodily injury, and I save that kind of separately for last because that one is often misinterpreted. This is not, I could have. This is not, I have the potential to. I threatened to. This is, I did. And serious bodily injury, it's not defined very well, but in different Office of Special Education programs, letters that have come out and guidance, it means I almost killed you. You almost lost a limb. It's serious. It's not, I had a teacher ask me at a meeting, she said, you know, last year, she's like, I know, I love this kid, but He stomped on my foot and broke 2 of my toes, and then he punched me and knocked out 2 teeth. I'm like, I am so sorry, but that wouldn't rise to the level. That means we need to do something different, right? We need to put some safety procedures in place. That's not what that means, though. All right, so we're still going to have this meeting because we need the documentation, but we can remove this student in these serious situations. So let's talk about the meeting itself. Make sure your teachers are prepped, just like for any meeting, but tell them what to bring. Bring data. What do you see in your classroom as far as the students' behavior, as far as their academic performance, as far as the characteristics of their disability? That piece is important. We don't talk about that enough. But really saying, just because I have ADHD does not mean that I'm impulsive, right? And so when you say, well, that was an impulsive act and he has ADHD, there's going to be a relationship. Not necessarily. If I have inattentive type, and what you're seeing in the classroom is not impulsivity, but you're seeing a lot of just, the being distracted, then there's not necessarily a connection between the disability and the behavior. So we've got to bring that kind of data about all of that stuff, and also about what have you done? Because sometimes we get that one teacher who comes into the meeting that says, you know what, I never see that in my class, but I'll tell you what I do. And you learn so much from that because you learn what you could then maybe put into that plan for the student. I'll just let you digest this for a minute. Because when you hold a manifestation, you don't go back to day 0. I'm already there, which means if I want to make any more removals, sometimes we hit manifestation in August. Any removal after that has to have a manifestation. So when something else happens, one thing I would do is tell you, let's look back. If it's the same behavior and we already knew from this last meeting that there's gonna be a relationship, why even bother with a removal? Let's do something different. Let's figure out what we can do. Think about whether we need to revise that behavior plan, because if it happens again, something's got to give. Something's got to change in order for the student to be successful. And sometimes it's placement. Sometimes when we keep having the same problem, we may need to make that change in placement. I know we want to stay in the least restrictive environment, but sometimes the least restrictive environment for student A is different than student B. And where I can be successful is my least restrictive environment. Did a removal work? Did it help? If not, let's do something different. If it didn't help before, if I enjoyed my days off, watching The Price is Right and having a good time, playing video games, whatever, it's not going to be helpful. So you got to think about what else that you can do. And remember that any day beyond 10 days of removal, we don't have to give any services those first 10 days. After the 10th day, if a student is out, we got to do something. If a student's out another day, we got to do something, whether it's a relationship or not.
We were taught CPI Q-tip, which is quit taking it personally.
Yes, I love that. I love that. Did you guys hear that? Q-tip. Communication. If we want to stay in compliance, let people know. If you send a kid home for 3 days and you don't tell the teacher of record, their count as to how many days this kid is out is off. And they don't necessarily know. Go ahead and start that FBA process. And every day that we don't have a kid is a day we could have taught them something, whether it's behavior, whether it's mental wellness, whether it's academics. Every day that they're away, we're losing something. So I know behavior is not the most fun as far as topics, but it's the one that gets us in the most trouble when it comes to compliance. So I'm going to hand it off to Patrick to talk about policies and procedures.
Okay, my name is Patrick McKinley. I'm the research director at the IEPTA Center. Thanks for reminding me. Not everyone here is familiar with me. So going in just a little bit, I'm going to talk about policies and procedures. There are certain sections within Article 7 where policies and or procedures are required. So your local education agency, your school, or your charter has to have something written locally saying, this is our interpretation of what the law says. This is how we apply this to our educational environment in our building. So you do have a little bit of flexibility, but as you'll notice, as you're looking through Article 7, if you haven't done so already, looking through some of those sections where it says you either need to have some procedures or policies and procedures, in most cases it's just procedures, there tends to be a long list of things you have to include in those policies and procedures. So just make sure you look at everything that's in there, make sure you have everything checked off in your handbook so that you are compliant with the law. What you're seeing on the slides here and on your handouts is not an exhaustive list. It goes far beyond, in some of these cases, what you're actually seeing on there. So just make sure you're actually referencing Article 7 to see it in its full form. So looking at the expectations around policies and procedures and what are the benefits of having policies and procedures. So both policies and procedures are going to help you support consistency and accuracy in your building. Bless you. If we don't have anything in writing saying this is how we do things in our building, you're going to have lots of different people having their own interpretations of what it says in Article 7 that they're expected to do. You're going to have folks saying, well, this is the way we've always done it, or maybe this is the way I did it in my old building. You probably heard that from folks that are coming in from other districts, or maybe this is the way we did it in Illinois. So you want to make sure that you've got something that everybody can reference so that they're all doing that consistently for any of those processes that are required within the law. Consistency and accuracy to make sure they're doing it right. Especially for some of those folks that might be coming out of state who may not have experience with Indiana law. I know we see that a lot in Northwest Indiana. Both policies and procedures can help establish that clear communication and guide decision making so that you know who do we go to for which steps within these processes that are required. What are those roles or what are those titles? Yes?
State law in Illinois corresponds with Indiana, and Indiana corresponds with Illinois, yes or no?
It should, but well, Indiana has Article 7. They have their own special ed law, their own interpretation, their own version of IDEA. And so there may be some slight differences. I'm not very familiar with Illinois law. I don't know anyone here who might be, but it's very similar.
We had our Iowa discussion.
Right, right.
More than anything between Illinois and Indiana. Ohio and Indiana has some differences, but it's pretty similar.
Yeah,
The timelines are.
some of the timelines, yeah.
The time to the base.
Some of the timelines are a little bit different. I have heard that.
Eligibility.
Oh, is it? Okay. Okay. Eligibility is a little bit different. Yeah. So it's just important to make sure you've got something that everybody can reference, essentially. The biggest difference between policies and procedures is that policies are really those broad level guidelines that give you that overall operation of your organization, and here's what we do. The procedures are more, here's how we get that done. So it's a little bit more specific, more step by step. That's where you're going to get a lot more details in there. But a lot of times they'll go hand in hand, and as you'll see, there are certain sections where policies are required in addition to procedures. So that might be involving a school board in those decisions. So here are the sections that we've highlighted in Article 7 that do require policies or procedures. I'm not going to go too in-depth on any of these because you can read the law yourself if you're having a night where you're bored and you want to just look through Article 7. This would be a great section to look for. Well, actually, unfortunately, there is no section of all the policies and procedures you have to have. You really have to hunt through. So fortunately, you've got these sections highlighted here so you can see 36-6 facilities. So you need to have something in place for emergency preparedness, for evacuation procedures, especially for students that have mobility issues, students in wheelchairs, visual impairments, anything like that, any kids that need some advanced or special warning. You need to make sure that those, to a certain degree, these procedures would need to be individualized for the individual kiddo. So they'd need to be on their IEP. So that means you want to review those annually. You want to make sure that you're implementing those procedures when you have drills as well. Medication administration. So this is one of those areas where you need to have policies and procedures. And this is important for all students, not just students with disabilities, because any kid could have medication needs. So this means you have to have some policies in regards to everything involving medication administration. So where can it be stored? How do you determine who's authorized to administer the medication? Making sure that the prescriptions are actually followed the way that they were written. What do you do about discontinuing medication in cases where it needs to be discontinued? What do you do at the end of the school year? So make sure you're looking through that section. There's a lot that's included there. Make sure you have all of those areas, all of those requirements included in your local handbook, in your local procedures and your policies. Notice of procedural safeguards. I know we've talked about this already today. You need to make sure that you have some sort of procedures that are written down that say, this is how we're going to inform parents or provide notice of procedural safeguards. These are the circumstances under which we do this, so that you don't have anybody forgetting, like a public agency rep, forgetting to provide that notice when there's a big behavior issue and maybe there is a removal or a change of placement. So make sure that you have some procedures around how you provide that notice of procedural safeguards. Confidentiality, we talked a little bit about this already. You need to have some procedures around how you're going to ensure that confidential information is stored appropriately. How are you going to make sure that you have someone who's assigned to be responsible for record keeping? What are you going to do to make sure that your staff are trained on how to handle sensitive and confidential information? You don't want IEPs just floating around everywhere. You want to have you want to maintain some control over the documents that you do have. What do you do in cases where the confidential records need to be destroyed? There's some rules around how long you have to keep special education records, so making sure that you're following all of those requirements under that section. So we've got a couple sections here under surrogate parents. They may not be as common as some of these other scenarios, but you just have to have something in writing saying, here's what we're going to do to make those decisions about whether a student needs to be assigned an educational surrogate parent, and procedures around how you're going to assign those surrogate parents and how a person may become eligible to serve as a surrogate parent. So how do you identify those people? Child find, so this is one of those areas where requirements are a little bit different for charter schools. So you are still expected to locate, identify, and evaluate all students within your building that have disabilities. So as you probably know, typical LEAs or traditional LEAs are expected to locate, identify, and evaluate all students within that boundaries, all students attending non-public schools within the boundaries, even if they live somewhere else. But in your case, you don't have as broad of expectations, but you still are expected to locate, identify, and evaluate those kids that are in the building. So given the parameters of child find for charter schools, you need to make sure that you have some policies that say, how are we going to ensure that we are fulfilling our obligations for child find as a building, and what are those things that we need to be looking for? So there's a lot under here beyond A and B that you'll want to make sure that you take a look at to see if you have that in your handbook. Okay, so make sure you've got everything in child find in your policies and procedures that's required from Article 7. Evaluations, we talked a lot about the timelines. You need to make sure that pretty much every step in the evaluation process, you have to have some sort of procedure saying, here's how we do this. So everything from here's how a parent requests an evaluation to here's how we determine who can be on that multidisciplinary team. to conduct the evaluation, to what are the tools or how do we make the decisions about what assessment tools to use, how do we make sure they're in the child's native language, how do we make sure that they're current. So basically everything that we do that we're required to do under evaluations, we need to make sure that we've got a procedure in saying how we're doing that locally. So it goes a lot more beyond number 3 here for procedures for reevals. But yes, that goes for initial vals and reevals as well. Local procedures and training. In this section, you're really expected to ensure that every aspect of the case conference committee process is implemented appropriately. So that's everything from determining, who can serve as the public agency rep, to what are the methods that you're using to ensure that parents are provided adequate notice of a case conference committee meeting. What methods are you using to determine that the parent understands the proceedings of that meeting? So everything involving the case conference committee process, make sure everything's in there. Least restrictive environment. So this one involves policies and procedures. So you need to have policies and procedures to ensure that students are educated in the least restrictive environment. So with their gen ed peers, at least to the maximum extent appropriate. So making sure you've got procedures around, making sure that the case conference committee is making that placement decision, making sure you have the continuum of services available to all students, making sure that all the boxes are checked for LRE essentially. Transportation to residential placements, so this isn't as common, but in cases where there are residential placements, you need to establish some guidelines and procedures for those arrangements that will need to be made and make sure that's communicated with parents. Mediation, so this is one section here where it's not required, but you can develop a procedure around in cases where there's a disagreement between the parent and the LEA. You can provide procedures around meeting or offering to meet with the parent to discuss the benefits of mediation. It's not required. I think the DOE probably put this in, or the state probably put this in, this requirement here, because there are some exceptions here or some things you need to look out for. So you need to make sure that if you do write procedures for doing something like this, that they're approved by the Department of Ed, by the Office of Special Education. And you need to be careful. You need to make sure that you're not using this process to delay or prevent parents from their right to due process hearings. So you just need to be a little bit careful here if you do develop processes around that. Okay, so just best practices here. After you have the written policies and procedures and you take a look at what you have in your handbook currently, just compare that with what's in Article 7 right now. You're probably used to seeing a lot of changes in your handbooks over the years. Typically, you're going to see a lot of things, changing as practices change in the building. So you want to make sure that the handbooks are reflecting what you currently are doing in your buildings. You may notice that there are certain areas where maybe you're seeing some performance area or issues, or maybe you're seeing some compliance issues, and it might be a good idea to add some additional policies and procedures in addition to what you're seeing that's required in Article 7. It might be a good idea to consult with your local attorney to see what are those areas they may recommend you add in addition to what's required by law. So some suggestions here for what you're going to do now. So look at what the existing practices are. Like I said, what's happening in your building. If you're noticing that there's a lot of steps that are not taking place that should be taking place based on what's in your handbook, then really take a look and consider, are there any changes that we need to make? Are there any changes that we can make? You don't want to pull out pieces that are actually required within Article 7, but ensuring that you're following the law, there's probably some level of flexibility in what you do. You may have some internal timelines that might be more restrictive than what Article 7 says. You're certainly welcome to be more restrictive than Article 7. So take a look at what's happening. If you have extra steps that really are no longer relevant, maybe there's been some changes to the structure within your organization and people's roles have shifted, it might no longer make sense to do things the way the handbook says. but you want to make sure that people are using the handbook so that you can tell people, okay, if you keep coming to me with the same types of questions, I want to be able to say, reference your handbook, reference, page 20 or page 30 on the handbook, because that's going to tell you exactly what you need. If after reading that, you still have some questions, then you can come to me. But you really want to avoid having people just come to you asking questions. What's our policy on this? What's our policy on that? You want to make sure you can say, go to the source, and they have an easy way to access that source. Whether it's a printed handbook that they've got, or some districts have an internal website, like a Google site or something, where they keep those, the current policies, and keep that up to date. And make sure that you're training staff in cases where you have some big changes on a policy, especially if it's a policy. But if you've got a major change or changes in your procedures, it's a good idea to have a plan for how are you going to inform staff of these changes. Because if you don't inform them, there's a good chance they're not going to know about them. And they may have some outdated procedures that they're referencing, and some of those steps may no longer really be the way that you're doing things anymore. So evaluate how things are working at least annually. It's a really good idea to take a look at those policies and procedures and say, okay, do we need to make any adjustments? And in some cases, maybe it is just training. The policies and procedures are fine. We just haven't adequately trained staff on that. So use your discretion on whether it needs to be a memo or an email, or if you really need to sit down with everybody in person and do a training on the changes in those documents. So we were asked by the Department of Education just to remind everybody during these trainings. I'm sure you are probably not all the right people to be giving this information for data exchange, but some of you might be. And if you're not, it's a good idea to share this information with the folks that you do have in your buildings, maybe data processing. I know in charters a lot of people wear multiple hats, so you or maybe another colleague that's here may be doing a lot of this data exchange, data collection and reporting work internally, or working with your vendor or working with the Department of Ed. But we just want to make sure everyone's aware of the resources that the department has right now. So the first link we have, this link is actually broken already. There's a new link, so they've updated this. But the new link is within that third bullet point, the data exchange for schools from the Department of Ed. But that's the link to the Knowledge Hub. So they've changed the way it looks. It looks a lot nicer. It's organized much better. And it has a really good search function as well. But that's essentially going to be the source of truth for all things data exchange. Any questions you have, it has a great search function. It's organized, I think, in a very logical manner. You can search by report. You can look at the tutorials for each of those reports and the layouts, the fields and the requirements, and everything that you need to know about how those reports work. And they wanted us to mention this to this group in particular, because I know there had been some reporting issues with some special education reports from some charter schools. So the Knowledge Hub, the one caveat with this is I noticed there are certain sections, like tutorials and some others, that are under construction. So I'd say for now, at least, go to the Moodle site. So the Moodle community for data exchange right now is where that's really the primary source of communication from the Department of Education. So that's where you're going to get the announcements, that's where you're going to get the updates, the known issues and issues that have been resolved. The community forums are on there, and they have, I don't think they're doing it in July, but typically they have twice a week, they have virtual office hours where they'll do answering questions that people have, and they archive those on the website as well. Those are also in Moodle. So for now, I would recommend your staff, if it's not you, if it's somebody else, make sure that your data folks are connected in that Moodle community for data exchange, and keeping up to date with that regularly, because there are a lot of changes and a lot of updates on that site. All right. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Jolly and let her wrap things up a little bit. Thank you for your time.
So congratulate yourself that you made it to this part of the day, because I'm the ending, or basically the closure. So we're almost done. So we just wanted you to as kind of a reflection, just to think about, so how is my building doing? What are those things I need to look for? And kind of just look through these. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them, but just kind of look at them and think, are we doing this well in our building, or is this something we really need to work on? For example, are all of our students growing? And if not, what groups of students aren't? And then maybe that's where you need to start, your work. Or is it our staff needs to build more competencies? Maybe there's some skills that they need that they don't have. And what are the things that they need to be learning so that they can help all students improve? Another one is, does our staff work together to support all students? Or do I think these are my students, those are your students, rather than they're all of our students? And then as far as parents, we want to make sure parents are involved and you have strong communication with your parents. And is there direct, explicit instruction to support not just academics, but also behavior and mental health? Do you have all those things in place, for your students? And then, of course, like what Patrick said, are there clear procedures in place to support legal compliance? And then the last one is just case conferences. Do they result in strong relationships? And do you celebrate growth in those conferences? And then what's next? Here are some things to consider. And I would say pick one of these things. What's one thing that you can do to increase positive relationships with students in your building? What's one thing you could do to change something at the next case conference you attend? Or what's a long-term goal you have for your building as far as moving to more inclusive culture or practices? Or what's something that I need to know more about? So I'm just going to take 2 minutes and talk at your table and just pick one of these things and just share, this is something that I really want to do more of, or really want to work on. And I hope you, when you go back and are meeting with your staff, that you can continue these conversations, because I was hearing a lot of good things. So I also want you to know if you look at the URL code that's on the right-hand side, that will take you right to any trainings that we provide. And again, our services are free to any of your schools, and we're always happy to come in and help and support the work that you're doing. So if you want to see what additional trainings are coming up, or if you need something specialized customized for your school, we're happy to do that as well. And this was a list of our presenters today. And then here's our contact information.